Hello, my name is Regan. I'm here today to talk on wetland hydrology and ecoflows, and I work in the National Parks and Wildlife Service in the Science and Biodiversity Unit. And a little about me, I'm technically the eco-hydrologist for the NPWS, and what that means is that I study the interaction between ecology and the water cycle. And generally, I'm interested in vegetation, and generally vegetation in the context of a habitat, and how that is either A, damaged through different pressures, environmental or otherwise, and how we need to restore that for conservation and restoration purposes, which we are often responsible for under different EU legislations. Now, these photographs here kind of encompass a lot of what I do. In the picture to the left, we have a flume, and I'm measuring water flows here from a particular bog. And we're trying to use that information to guide how we manage the site, because we need to understand how it's working. And in the background, you have a digger, and that digger is doing some work basically to remediate some drainage and hopefully improve the ecology of the site. And I'll look at what that means later on. And we do other types of work like measuring the flows in the river in relation to the occurrence of particular species. In this case here, it's a freshwater pearl mussel. So what I'd like to talk now a little bit about is conservation in Ireland and how hydrology interacts. So in NPWS, we're basically an agency with a few different units. I'm in science and biodiversity, and what we do is we inform how management is carried out for particular areas across the country, those areas that are protected. But we also have other units that deal with ecological assessment in terms of legislation and proposed infrastructure projects. We have a peatland policy unit in Ireland because it's so topical, and we'll look at that later on. We have an agroecology unit that works with farmers to try and improve practices on agricultural land for biodiversity gain, and also a marine. And we are really guided by a lot of work and legislation from the EU, particularly the Birds Directive from 1979, the Habitats Directive from 1992, more recently the Water Framework Directive and Marine Framework Directives, and also other national legislation related to wildlife and EIA and this type of thing. But we're really geared towards managing and conserving sites that are designated under the Habitats Directive, and these are called SACs, Special Areas of Conservation. And special areas of conservation are grouped together across Europe and are termed Natura 2000. So the aim of the Habitats Directive is to protect biodiversity by designating sites as SACs. And that was done in Ireland in 1992, and in more recent years, the Water Framework Directive has interacted with that by designating sites as groundwater dependent terrestrial ecosystems. So basically a habitat that requires or depends on groundwater to sustain it. And that could be anything from a fen to a turlough and even a bog, even though a bog is rain fed. But we'll look at a little bit about what that is. So across Europe, there's SACs designated across the continent, and I think the coverage is somewhere between 25 and 28%. I think that will increase to 30% over the next few years, particularly with the biodiversity crisis that has been announced or was announced by the EU back in 2019. And Ireland, our national government, has also announced a biodiversity crisis. So there's moves on foot to increase that area for the protection of habitats there. And in Ireland, we have just under 450 areas designated as SAC, and that encompasses anything from a river to a bog. We also have 154 SPAs, that's a special area of conservation, and that's for just through the Birds Directive. So all in all, we've around 1 million hectares of land in Ireland designated as a protected area. Around 90% of that is privately owned, so that can be difficult when trying to manage it for ecological. Every 6 years in the NPWS, we have to report on the condition of habitats across the country to the EU, and we publish a report every 6 years in this. The situation is not good. Most habitats in Ireland are in a bad state, i.e. they're damaged and they're getting worse. So we've been tracking this since the early 90s, and every 6 years generally things get worse, mainly because the land is badly managed and that has an impact on the protected areas, and also because we don't have the resources, staff or finance to implement the measures that are needed to contain those pressures and improve conditions. Now that is improving a little bit now on the bogs, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. And just an example here is the blanket bogs, which are generally distributed on the west side of the country in upland areas with a lot of pressures, fires, overgrazing, drainage, and this type of thing. So yeah, these are not good. And that is mirrored across Europe, in fact. Generally, the habitats worst affected are wetlands, mainly because wetlands are not very resistant to change. And the reason for that is because they're wet, they're full of water, very easy to drain. And when you drain something, you generally change its properties, the soil and physical properties. And it's very hard to reverse that afterwards to get it back into a good condition. Not impossible, but difficult, and often at a financial expense. And we'll look a little bit at that later on. Now there is a newfound awareness, probably not for people and this type of group, but in the general public, of the importance of keeping ecosystems in good condition, not just for biodiversity, but also for human well-being, mental health, this type of thing. So it's good to see that being more prominent now in the last year or so. Okay, so what I'm going to talk a bit about now are ecoflows and metrics. The ecoflow, it's been a concept that's been around for a while, and in fact I found a paper in the hydrology journal from the late 90s where it goes into depth on this and gives some nice concepts around what an ecoflow means. Essentially, ecologists study species and communities and where they occur and this type of thing. And where an ecoflow interacts with our discipline is trying to understand what are the abiotic factors that maintain that ecology, generally vegetation, in a good condition. So generally we're talking about water, but also soil properties and soil chemistry. And basically what we need to know is what sustains the ecology at a species level. So a species level might be a particular plant that receives groundwater seepage, like an orchid or something like that on a fen, but also at the habitat level. So the regional context, the regional hydrology. And again, it could be something like a fen or a bog. And trying to understand, what are those hydrological conditions that kind of keep the habitat in good nick, but also why it developed there at all in the first place. And this information is important because we need to understand how it will respond to change. And that is important, I would say, for a lot of people on this group who are maybe studying or writing EIAs, NISs, this type of thing. That you need to understand if something does go ahead, like a road development, and it is close to Peatlands, for example, that is an SAC, what impact will that have? So these are important concepts to get right in your own head before trying to describe potential conditions. And so what we have here is just a summary of what kind of conditions influence the composition of a particular plant species, and by the same degree, the habitat condition. And you can see from the diagram the factors to consider mainly are soil properties, as I say, chemistry, the water regime, and how that interacts with the plant and soil. Now, the reality is those type of interactions are very, very complicated, and they often take many years of study to really understand how those interactions behave and how we quantify. However, we can come up with metrics to simplify those interactions and just give us a measure on how particular ecosystems may be sustained. And basically what we try to do is classify an ecosystem, and in this case here I have it as an example of either having a surplus of water or a deficit of water, i.e. And also quantity and quality are important here. in terms of nutrients and also the acidity of the water. Now, this type of metric should be understood in parallel with indicators of hydrological alteration. So that could mean, say, a modification of a river's morphology. So generally rivers are not in straight lines and they don't have just regular consistent depth. They generally wind and have bumps and hollows and this type of thing, and that supports a rich biodiversity in terms of the river ecosystem. When you drain it and dredge and this type of thing, you get rid of all that. So that'll have an impact on the ecosystem and its metric. And also, of course, water extraction, which could be drainage or it could be dewatering or over pumping, anything like that. And of course, climate change is here. Air temperatures are increasing. There's more evaporation. So that's also a hydrological alteration. So basically, we're trying to understand that in terms of the flow, either surface or the groundwater regime, and assess how changes may impact on sustainability of ecosystems, and ultimately, in terms of hydrological management, guide management decisions. And how people have generally conceptualized this is in terms of the flow duration curve. And I'm sure a lot of you have already encountered stuff like this in your career. They're quite easy to compute and to put together. The key here is actually having a good time series, preferably years, for the ecosystem in question. So an example I have presented here is from a researcher, Gao, and this is based on rivers in China. And basically, as we know, a lot of rivers in China are used for dams, and that has an impact on the ecology of the river systems. And this group have put together these flow duration curves, and they've tried to understand when a river system may have too much water, quote unquote, versus when it has a deficit. And it does that in the context of the percentile of the flow duration curve, which is a measurement of the time percentage during which a specified flow is equalized or exceeded. And also they've looked at the different indicators of hydrological alteration, and that's a table here on the right. And this can be very easily done to any flow record that is collected anywhere in the world. Doesn't matter if it's China or Ireland, that can be done here, and it is done here a lot. And when you understand the ecosystem that you're looking at, and you can measure where, say, it's in a good condition or where it's in a bad condition, and you can measure a parameter such as this, you can begin to develop, notional thresholds of where the divide is between good and bad, where you might have a deficit or surplus of water, this type of thing. And these thresholds will change based on the nature of the ecological receptor. So some systems can be more resilient to say higher magnitudes of flow or greater frequencies of low flow conditions, this type of thing. So an example I have here is from a river in the west of Undorica. It's in the Delphi Valley, and what you see here is the flow duration curve, and this is collected over a few years by a station maintained by the EPA. And what we've noticed in the past few years is that the river is getting drier for longer in the summertime. Now, this particular catchment has little to no groundwater base flow. Its waters all come from the mountains, very steep relief, this type of thing. So it's very, very flashy. Now, the pearl mussel, the freshwater pearl mussel, if you're not familiar with this big kind of oyster type of a critter living in only very clean rivers across Ireland, and it's been around for 100, 200 years. They live that long. They're quite resilient creatures to change, but there are parts of the river that are becoming drier. And basically, we did a study to understand where that threshold was, and we discovered, in this particular location, where that is, and that'll inform us how to manage the river. Basically, we just have to narrow it in a particular section of the river that's widening due to erosion. There are stone weirs here that have changed the patterns, but the river has stabilized. Anyway, it's an example of how you use a flow duration curve to inform ecological management. Another example here is a bog, Clara Bog. I'm sure lots of you have heard of it. I'm going to talk more on this later on. But basically, as a study that I carried out here, I had 2 catchments monitored for flow over a number of years, and over time I started to notice a change in the flow duration statistics. So rather than just getting the flow duration, I compared the mean flow versus the kind of the base flow in terms of its duration over a few years, and basically I noticed that one area was getting drier, one area was getting wetter, and that kind of matched what we were mapping in ecology. One was getting, one we were getting dry vegetation kind of coming in, and the other area was getting slightly wetter, and we used that as a metric for how of the condition of this. And of course, in Ireland we have a lot of turloughs. I won't dwell on this; it's been covered already. But work done by Owen Nocton. He was basically able to classify different turloughs in terms of their flood duration frequency regime. And basically, these 3 types of broad types of turlough. One had a lot of storage, slowly releases the water. Another gets a little bit more responsive, and the ecologies match that. So basically, what I'm saying is, measuring water level and or water flow over a number of years will allow you to develop a relationship or behavior for that particular system. And if you can link that with the ecology it supports, you can begin to develop a metric. And if that metric or flood or flow regime begins to change, you can link that to a probable or predicted change in ecology. Now, the other thing to remember with this type of stuff, ecology doesn't really have a fixed threshold. It has a duration of exceedance over a fixed threshold. So what that means is you need to incorporate an element of time into the development of these metrics, which the flow duration curve does. And this gives you an idea of resilience of the ecosystem. So what we have here, we've got basically 2 hydrographs. One is very flashy, and one is very more attenuating. So in a flashy regime, which could be something like a Bondorica river, or a river, in the mountains, that basically responds very, very quickly to rainfall, and then it quickly recedes. That is more resilient to change, because if there is damage in the catchment, it's easier to fix because you can get that regime back quite quickly. And the ecology you find in that type of regime is generally quite hard. Whereas in an area that has attenuating flow, and this can be something like a bog, it's less resilient to change, because once you reduce that storage in the system, it's difficult to get it back. And we'll look at that now in a moment. So what I would like to talk about now are peatlands. So I'll just give a general overview of peatlands in Ireland, and then how we understand them hydrologically, and how this impacts on areas of our work concerning restoration and conservation. But I think for a lot of you listening here today, I think you will all encounter peatlands working in Ireland, whether it's part of wind farms, roads, forestry, nutrients, this type of thing. This is peatlands will inevitably come across your desk. So they're particularly important in Ireland, mainly because they cover so much of the country. I mean, 20 to 25% of Ireland is peatland, whereas if you go to other countries in Europe, it's far, far smaller, so it's less important. But they do have global impact, and I'll look at that now in a moment. They're rich in biodiversity, generally due to the vegetation that they support, adapted to wet, acidic environments, basically. They are important for climate regulation and mitigation. Peat is basically a newer form of coal, and it has been sequestering carbon for thousands of years. However, when you drain it, the opposite occurs. And they're important water sources, also in Ireland, in the uplands, not so much the lowlands, but in the uplands. And we'll look at that in a moment. So there is a big driver in Ireland at the moment to conserve what we have and to try to restore what is damaged. And from what I said earlier, that is pretty much most of it. That's over 90% of it is damaged. So there's a lot of work going on in this area now. And as I mentioned, it's also a big constraint in EIA, NIS and land management, and any infrastructure development proposed, whether that's a wind farm, it's a road, ammonia emissions from production sites, deforestation, agriculture, etc. So in terms of Ireland's peatlands, okay, well, as I say, 25% of countries is covered in peatland. We get the blanket bog in the upland, the raised bogs in the lowland, and where we have groundwater interacting with the landscape, we get fens that are minerotrophic. The vast majority of the peatland is actually blanket bog, just under 1 million hectares, 3 to 500,000 hectares raised bog, and only around 70,000 to 80,000 hectares actually fen. So majority is blanket bog in the up. They're important for climate regulation. Around 3% of the Earth's terrestrial surface is covered in peatland, but they've been persistently accumulating carbon over the last 5 to 10,000 years. And that's what this figure here is showing you, that the peatland is sequestering around 30 grams of carbon per meter squared per year on average. And that's what becomes peat. And it's due to these guys called phloem, and they're mosses that grow at the top and they have no roots, so they break down and that becomes peat. So they're always growing towards the surface where there's light, so it's absorbing carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. And for that process to occur, it has to have water, and it's ensuring that they, have that ability to sequester the carbon. And because they have no roots, the water table has to be very close to the surface. So you can see how easily these systems can get damaged. And on average, peatland will sequester around 2 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year. Some of that becomes methane and DOC, which I'm looking at. Now, in Ireland, this is generally the picture we're dealing with. We've got uplands here with a lot of exposed peat. It's exposed because it's eroded. And it's eroded generally because there's been some drainage and overgrazing, so the vegetation layer has disappeared. Peat is like milk, so when it rains heavily, it'll just erode away. And on the right hand side here, we've got a production site like Bordnamona, which is used for peat extraction and energy for up until this year, basically, and now it's stopped. We've got some marginal turf cutting and land converted from peat to agriculture. So these are the big pressures. So these type of areas actually emit a lot of CO2. In fact, they emit around 6 tons of CO2 per hectare per year. And that actually amounts to around 5% of the global greenhouse gas emissions can be ascribed to peatland drainage. Ireland is obviously a drop in the ocean, but there's a lot of peatlands in countries like Indonesia, which have rainforests on them, and they're being drained for palm oil and this type of thing. So that's all gone back into the atmosphere. And in Ireland, we estimate around 4 to 6 million tonnes of CO2 comes from peatlands in Ireland, which is around 1/7 of our national greenhouse gas emissions. So in terms of the restoration, we basically need to remedy damage, which is generally drainage, and get them back to being carbon sequestration systems, which is easier said than done. And this kind of summarizes the carbon balance of intact bogs, which you can see here takes in carbon, releases methane, but it's an overall sink. When it's drained, it's a big emitter, and then we can restore it, and in time we'll get that. And just to demonstrate what this actually means, intact bogs sequester carbon, and they do that when they've got a high water table. Now, over the course of a year, peatlands will actually naturally emit and sequester carbon, and that's what this graph here is telling us here on the side. So most of the uptake through photosynthesis occurs in the summertime when it's basically bright. And because the intact system is not being drained, it basically retains that water over the summertime, and that's why this process can happen. And if we had left our peatlands alone, we'd probably be sequestering around 3 million tonnes of carbon dioxide per year. At the moment, we're only sequestering maybe tens of thousands. And this is what it looks like in terms of just a carbon balance. I won't labour on this too much, but what this means is the peatland is taking in CO2. Some of that goes back up as methane, and some of it goes back out as DOC, dissolved organic carbon. So around 25% or so is released as DOC, around 10 is methane, is released as methane, but the rest is actually stored as carbon. Around 20 to 30 grams of carbon per meter square per year, as I mentioned earlier. Now, when you drop the water table, you begin to oxidize the peat, and it releases that stored carbon back to the atmosphere. Yeah, and it's releasing something like 100, 300 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. So basically, it's the changes in the water table by alterations that induce this. So it has impacts for climate change and also water quality. And yeah, it's a big part of our emissions. So what we need to do is try to restore peatlands in Ireland. And that's the basis of this talk. To understand, so to do that, we need to understand what the hydrology is, what is the hydrology we want to get back, and how do we do that? And basically, the criteria for sustainability and the implications of that. So how we wet peat? Well, they say here restoration is re-establishing the hydrological conditions, but we've got to understand what those are. And here we have a water table from two contrasting areas of a peatland. The blue graph, at the blue line on the graph at the top of the figure, is an area where it's nice and intact. You've got all this kind of sphagnum, and that's sequestering carbon, etc., etc. And basically, the water table is quite high, and where it's drained and it's dry, it's very, very low. And again, we do a flow duration curve analysis in this, and we basically find that where you have an intact bog, the water table is at or just below the ground surface for 90% of the year, whereas where it's drained, it's not like that at all. So this is what we've got to get back to, is to get from that dry red line here up to the blue line here. And what these are here, this is just an ecological classification for areas of wet bog. So in engineering and hydrology, we are just trying to get from a damaged situation back to a situation that resembles an intact situation. And what we need to understand as hydrologists is what controls the water table. And we've done a lot of study on this in Ireland over the past few years. Slope is a key one, where lowland peatland is nice and flat. You will tend to get good sphagnum generation. The problem with when you drain peat, it begins to shrink and contract and subside. So you introduce the hydrological properties of the peat are important. Peat should impede flow. So even though it's full of water, there's very, very little porosity and permeability in the peat because it's all immobile. It's stored in the organic matter rather than flowing through it. So that's an important control on the water table. What we find is that when you drain peat, you basically crack it, and when you crack it, you introduce secondary porosity, kind of like you'd get in a limestone, for example, where you get conduits and fractures in the relatively impermeable bedrock, but the water will flow through the conduits. That same thing happens in peat when you dry it. Very problematic. And the other important discovery we've made in Ireland on peatlands in the past few years is the control of regional groundwater. So the head in the groundwater in the aquifer system below the peat actually helps support the water table on the peatland surface, and that generally occurs when when the peat sits on a more permeable subsoil than a clay, which we often get. But this is actually very, very common occurrence. And I'll just skip through this, but for this a Clara bog where we found subsurface drainage, basically draining the water table and damaging the ecology. And what this figure here is showing is how an under gravel ridge is basically drawing down the water table in the bog because of drainage on the margin. And these are kind of considerations we have to make in our management. Now, because peatlands are important for a number of different reasons, there's a lot of different restoration programs occurring across Ireland at the moment. The biggest one is Bord na Móna, basically restoring over 33,000 hectares of their land. So it's the biggest ecological scheme to this. So in terms of the water management, we're trying to get to a situation where we have a water table in the peat. That's what I have as unrestored here, to re-establishing a water table close to the surface, which is restored here, and something that mimics a natural situation. Now, once you drain a peatland, it'll actually take hundreds of years to get back to anything like it was, because the vegetation needs to build up at the top. But you can get something close to it in a few years. In terms of the water management, we generally put in dams to try and raise the water table like this. And this is the threshold we're looking for: 100 millimeters from below the surface or just above it, and try and get that for 90% of the year at least. So that's the water table control. When peat sits on permeable material, which often happens, you need to build dams that are deeper, and basically intercepting the subterranean flow paths. And that's the only way to raise water tables in that situation. The problem with this is that it's extremely expensive to do. It's very difficult to get that across the line in terms of management, but we are working on it on a couple of sites. And of course, some geotechnical considerations is the impact of upward hydraulic gradients on the stability of dams. And dams have failed in Ireland due to this situation on peatland, because they didn't do the necessary investigation. In terms of what this looks like on the ground, is some work we've done in just in the past year or so at a couple of raised bogs in Mead and Tipperary. And we can see here, after putting in some dams and berms and this type of stuff, you get the ground surface getting nice and wet again. And in time, this will start to get some of those other benefits. So those type of situations are generally on the lowland raised bogs. We are starting to get into the territory of addressing our upland blanket bogs, which, as I said at the start, cover most of the peatland coverage in Ireland, yet have been relatively unmanaged up until now. The reason for that is that they are difficult to manage because they're on steep slopes. So it's difficult to put in structures there that won't just slip when it rains. There's a lot of commonage, so there's a lot of private ownership, there's grazing. It's a big one, and it's important here and in the UK, because most of water drank in the UK and Ireland is actually derived from water that flows over peatland, and this is a huge expense in water treatment in terms of the DOC. I won't get into that today, but DOC is a natural emission from peatland because it's organic matter, but when you drain it, the load of DOC increases enormously because there's no storage in the catchment. So this is very expensive in water treatment. But we are this in the Dublin Wicklow Mountains with a new project we have funded with Intel, but also in the West Wild Atlantic Nature, which will be doing a huge amount of work on that. So this is just an example of what a hydrograph looks like on a blanket bog that's drained, which is here on the left. So you can see here it's very flashy, very spiky. Basically, it rains, it literally pours, and no water stored in the catchment. So the area itself is very, very dry. And Ray Flynn in Queens has done a huge amount of great work on this type of thing. And you can see the difference between an intact peatland catchment up in the uplands and a degraded one. The degraded one just doesn't store water, whereas the intact one keeps it, and generally the habitat is conditioned. And what I'm dealing with at the moment is the rehabilitation of the Bordemona bogs. So basically, a lot of these sites were used for production for peat energy for many, many years, since the 50s. So they are being decommissioned at the moment, and basically we're being restored back to kind of ecological habitats. And you can see here in this picture is basically encapsulates the difficulty with this type of scenario. The bog here is beside the River Shannon, and you can see here with the white on the aerial photo, it is being cut down to the mineral soil. So this is really, really problematic in terms of trying to restore it to some sort of. And here are two cross sections through that peatland. So on the left-hand side is the current situation, that you find that the bog has been cut to below the level of the Shannon, and only marginally above its low summer water level. And basically, a site like this is pumped to keep it dry, so the peat could be extracted, and it's a lot deeper than it was. So basically, it's all being pumped away, and you'll find that the mineral soil is often gravel. In fact, so you've got water going up if it's cut as low as that, and if it's a bit higher, you've actually got subterranean drainage. So if you put on dams and berms at the top, it'll do nothing because it's all going underneath. The problem we're encountering now is that when you switch off the pumps, the peatland will just become a lake, or at best a seasonally inundated wetland. Very hard to get these areas back to peat forming conditions. So that's something we're trying to work out at the moment, as this is quite a new and novel project. Basically, that encapsulates, I think, just the situation in wetland hydrology in Ireland, which is, as you can see, dominated by peatlands. Huge incentives now and projects to restore them, and literally hundreds of millions to do it, mainly pushed by climate mitigation benefits for Ireland and reaching our climate action goals. And what it needs is thorough hydrological understanding. We know a lot, but we still have a lot more to discover. And if anyone wanted to get into this sphere, we are lacking environmental engineers to do this type of work. And if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to take them. Thank you.